your imaginations go crazy. And so we started thinking about three big ideas that we could propose that would create these resiliency provocations, so to speak. So the goal is to be as real as practical, and to point out some of the deficiencies with things like Chapter 91, for example. So you'll notice with some of the ideas that we have, there will be clashes with the existing infrastructure and laws that are in place. And that's kind of the point, is to really put out the big picture ideas that we need to start asking so we can truly solve our challenges. So with that, I'll be sharing my screen here, and apologies for just this taking a moment. But anyhow, let's see here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see the screen. And with that, I am going to turn it over to us to present to you our three big ideas.
Here, welcome to our ABX presentation on radical resiliency. Three big ideas to help Boston thrive in century number 22. The goal of this presentation, and we'll introduce ourselves in a moment as the speakers, was to come up with three big solutions that aren't necessarily being asked that can help Boston and other coastal cities thrive in the 22nd century and beyond. And we have sort of ordered these into a natural progression of terra firma, holes and hills, ecological, holistic solutions that will unfold together as a unified team. And so we've pulled together three speakers from leading firms that are working in resiliency practices in and around Boston. Speaking here, my name is Blake Jackson. I'm the Sustainable Design Leader for Stantec Boston and the U.S. Northeast, and I'm a practicing architect working on master planning, commercial, and multifamily housing projects in and around the city and beyond.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dave Hampton. I'm a Climate Resilience Associate at the Cadmus Group, based kind of in Boston, mostly in my house.
Hello, everybody. My name is Isabel Calvish. I'm a project manager at Niche Engineering. I'm an urban and environmental planner and resilience expert, and work towards advancing sustainable and resilient projects at Niche. I manage interdisciplinary projects such as Climate Ready Dorchester and Mobley Park, where Niche is supporting the development of smart resilience and good infrastructure strategies, and also solving transportation planning, permitting, and stormwater design in the case of Mobley Park.
Okay, wonderful. So with that, you know, I was the sort of troublemaker that brought these other two colleagues together, and we started this presentation not necessarily with the ultimate goal of being an ABX presentation, although that seems to be what it has turned into, but the origination of the conversation became this idea of, you know, are we solving the right problems? Are we asking the right questions? Are we thinking big enough, or are we just utilizing off-the-shelf technology, perhaps even Band-Aids, just to get us through to the next day? And so this presentation is intended to provoke. It's intended to think beyond the limits of practice today to think about the type of city that we're going to need beyond 2070. And with that, I'll dive right into some of the introductory work that went into my big idea, terra firma. And, you know, this image is a little hazy, but one thing I like about it is it really begins to show that even though we're exploring outer space and we've got Elon Musk working on getting us onto Mars and beyond, coastal cities play a vital role in human civilization and have since the dawn of human civilization, and they will continue to do so even during COVID and post-COVID. And this is one of many diagrams that I could have chosen to really talk about the importance of coastal cities and their interconnectivity internationally, and their purpose in being a place that not only does commerce, but also is a place where people want to be. And we're going to talk a lot about Boston tonight. We realize this is a Boston-based conference with a New England-based clientele, and this is going to feel like an Aflac and Matt Damon movie after we're done, I'm sure. And this is a look at our beloved city where the three speakers are practicing. And hopefully you've been to visit Boston before. And if not, we'd surely love to show you around back when that's in the future when that's a possibility. But I love this image from the air just because it shows you don't have to get very high to realize that we are surrounded by water in Boston. And it's open harbor. It's the Charles River to the north, which separates us from Cambridge, and it actually works its way in many different areas underground, and we don't even see it in many instances. And if we think about Boston, it's 400 years of urban morphology from its founding by the Pilgrims up until today. We've actually grown the city by expanding into the water. And, there's a big debate nowadays about should we retreat from the water, should we retreat inland, what's the future of coastal cities with climate change and sea level rise. And I'm of the opinion that maybe we continue to develop into the water. And it's in our best interest because if we don't, the morphology of Boston by 2070 will begin to mimic what it looks like or did look like when the Pilgrims arrived in 1630 because of climate change and sea level rise. And the approach right now within the city of Boston is to do this brick by brick method or a parcel by parcel method, whereby we utilize new developments and large scale renovation projects as they come on board in order to piecemeal the protection needed to modernize our resilience relative to stormwater and heat island and sea level rise and blue, green, and gray infrastructure, so to speak. On the flip side, the other methodology would be to lift a mountain, so to speak, or to think in terms of big scale urban mega infrastructure projects. And, the goal was to think big. And so at least with terra firma, I'm not thinking in terms of brick by brick, but more of the moving of the mountain that I feel is necessary to protect us. And I'm certainly not the first or only person who has thought about this. So this is a plan from the mid-1980s done by Antonio de Mbomba, and he envisioned a plan whereby we would link Winthrop to Quincy via harbor islands and via sort of green and gray infrastructure projects that would, broaden the city, enrich the city, create opportunities that didn't exist before, and, buy us the long-term protection that we'll need in a changing climate. And more recently, there have been adaptations of this plan that look at just what it would take to protect the inner harbor, utilizing DeMombrio's plan of the harbor line necklace that connects Winthrop to Quincy. More ambitious would be connecting the outer harbor, which is Winthrop all the way and everything to the west. And then a more recent development within this plan would be the sapphire necklace, which sort of utilizes a hybrid approach to these series of plans in order to buy protection, acknowledging the fact that some climate change is inevitable. And I would like to remind the good people of Boston that we have done and performed large-scale infrastructure projects before, and perhaps the large-scale infrastructure projects of the past are impeding us from being able to envision into the future just because, there were the unintended consequences and price overruns that were associated with them. But I continue to be an advocate of dreaming big. And this is just a look at the before and after of the Big Dig project when we buried I-93 going through downtown just a few decades ago. And we're going to have to think big because climate change implications for Boston are huge. So we get the worst of all the weather, even though this guy and his dog looked pretty happy on this day. I remember this was 2015 in Southie, and this was a really difficult time for the city because we had what we refer to as our snowpocalypse. And in 2017, 3 northeasters in January hit back to back to back, which basically turned our 2030 predictions into 2017 realities. And so we're acknowledging the fact that maybe even our best climate scientists don't really really understand the level of detail or concern in their predictions. Maybe they're a bit too conservative. The jury is still out. And so I began to look at where our development is being planned and where is our most vulnerable sites relative to the area of most interest. And it just so happens to be our beloved seaport. And this is a look at the seaport. Not quite fully built out. There's a few parcels to the right-hand side that have come online to this, but this is what it will look like basically from the trade center west once completed. And this is Boston's hottest real estate market. It's the place to be, and it's right on the water, for better or for worse. And certainly we're interested in that. It's where a lot of our commerce, it's where a lot of our housing is being built. It's some of our most cherished new urban public spaces right near the harbor. And so being a resident of the area as well as having my office here got me looking at this specific neighborhood. And again, this isn't to pave a pathway for the seaport in particular. This idea is just utilizing the seaport to say that, hey, we could do this in any Boston neighborhood. Let's just use the one that has the best data, so to speak. And so this is utilizing the Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer tool to look at various different resiliency issues associated with the neighborhood. And so we don't really have social vulnerabilities in this neighborhood. It's a brand new neighborhood, and one could, this could be its own presentation, whether or not that's a good thing that it doesn't have any social vulnerabilities to address. But it does have a pretty pronounced urban heat island. The development is all post-industrial land that's completely impervious, and as new development comes on, it will do its part in cooling the environment, but it's something that can be addressed through development, which is what we're proposing with Terra Firma. This is a look at the near-term and long-term stormwater issues within the site. Again, this is low-lying coastal land. This is a look at high tides between 2030 and 2070. You begin to see that already the sea is beginning to move back towards the 1630 urban morphology, or even land morphology, so to speak. And if we look at 10% and 1% coastal flooding risk over that time, 2030 to 2070, you begin to see that the entire neighborhood almost, spare a few areas, will be completely inundated and will return back to water. This is just a look at where those entry points are. And so you can see that it's not just one area that is at risk, but many potential pathways into the development. And not just here, this becomes a threat to the south end as well as to sites south of here. So this is an urban-wide challenge. So again, using the seaport, but to say that we need to think big for the entirety of the city in the way de Malbrio did in his earlier visions. And this is a look at where the current city planning is relative to rolling out protection by 2050. And 2050 is really that moment. One could argue 2030, and I probably should say 2030 will be the moment at which it's too late to do anything, and at 2050 it completely spirals out of control. And so this is a time-based solution. We have 47 miles of urban coastline in Boston. It's very expensive and cumbersome, although necessary, to protect all 47 miles at the same time. So this is looking at near term, where the investment needs to happen first, through long term, where we can buy ourselves a little bit of time to do projects at a later date. And again, this is with the brick by brick or parcel by parcel development upgrade approach. And these are numbers from 2018, which are the latest numbers that I could find that have been quantified as part of the Climate Ready Boston reporting. The capital cost to realize these measures in 2018 dollars was between $513 million to $1 billion, with an annual maintenance cost between $7.7 to $15 million, a net project benefit of 3.9 to 9. I couldn't find the exact definition of what this meant, but I believe that it meant the money invested relative to the real estate protected, and the benefit to cost ratio, which is the sum of the two numbers above relative to the net project benefit, which is somewhere between 8.7 to 44.9. But I would suggest we just focus on these larger numbers than the first three categories up to the top here. So again, there's already, for a brand new neighborhood, there's already a lot of risk built into it that, you know, comes with the territory, so to speak. And if we start to look at the exposure also in place at 2018, currently almost 1,000 people, 60 buildings, and $140 million worth of damages can be expected from issues like what we talked about with 2017 and also 2015 with the snowpocalypse. But if you look at 2030, this number begins to ramp up pretty substantially. The amount of money involved ratchets up about 10 times. And then at 2050, it really begins to spiral out of control. So that as a business case or a business as usual case, we're looking at upwards of 40,000 people impacted, over 5,100 buildings, and $8.1 billion of damages if we don't do anything. So again, we are talking about 2030. If we don't do anything by then it completely spirals out of control by 2050 and beyond. And it's not such a foreign idea even today to build into the land. So even though the retreat is a conversation being had by others, there are proposals now along Northern Avenue, along the 4-Point Channel that are actually proposing to build in and build sort of green to gray infrastructure and active barriers and to maintain accessibility to the waterfront and recreation space and a series of different experiences, because again, it's not just about real estate and risk, it's also about people space and being where you want, you know, the water being a place where we can develop and also a place where we want to develop. And being the largest, you know, natural aspect of Boston, it's pretty important, one would argue. It's the reason why we settled here in the first place. And this is being, you know, these types of measures are not just being looked at those two sites, but all around this area of protection, which we're talking about here, and various different strategies, which I'm sure the other panelists will talk about a little bit later. And this is just one look at this idea behind a living shoreline. This is sort of the east side of the 4-Point Channel in the seaport. It looks at what was going to be the GE headquarters and this notion that we're going to have some flooding and maybe that's okay. But I question that, because there is very limited connectivity between this new neighborhood and the city. And so if we have flooding in the 4-Point Channel, suddenly it creates a scenario where South Boston becomes really an island. And its connectivity to the city becomes, to me, one of the biggest challenges and risks of not thinking big enough. And right now it's already difficult from a traffic standpoint to get to and from this part of the city to the city proper. Do we really want to risk making that worse? And, you know, again, this is just another look at how the idea is being carried on south of here and other areas of the city. East Boston is another, Moakley Park and the Bayside neighborhood and 4-Point, future Columbia Point, protection plans. You know, we're having to think about this because the water is going to rise simultaneously everywhere. So it's a time-based situation that we're looking at. And, you know, right now the solution is maybe to build up. Maybe the solution is to build up and out, or maybe just out. Let's talk about a little bit what that looks like. And again, I'm not trying to say that Dubai's got it right, specifically from a sustainability standpoint, but building out into the land creates an opportunity. New terra firma increases the real estate that is in and around the waterfront, and certainly that is economically a very viable option. We need to make it an ecological option as well. And so this is a zoom out of the seaport and a look at our boundary condition of the area that I would say that we would utilize the terra firma approach to impact. And so what is the challenge? Well, it's the fact that we have 8.25 linear miles of waterfront to protect. It basically protects everything from the sea terminal all the way to South Station and everything behind it. And my solution is simple. Let's build out a few feet to create a continuous harbor walk. It's not disjointed as the current one is. That basically lessens the problem. So by making the amount of shoreline smaller, we've cut the problem essentially in half to 4.2 linear miles of wall. And it could even be done differently, but what we tried to do here is maintain some of the historic 4-Point Channel, access to the cruise ships, as well as the maintenance areas for ships in the eastern point down here. And when you do that, well, what does it create? Well, in this case, it creates 4.2 almost million square feet of terra firma, or roughly 96.3 acres of new land in a city projected to grow by 2030 to 130,000 new inhabitants. And we've got to have places to put them. And we've got to have new businesses to meet their needs and provide services to them. And what better way to do this than to further densify in the urban core on newly protected land that buys the affordability of the protection of the neighborhood behind it. It maintains accessibility in a new route, east-west as well as north-south, into the Leather District and into Chinatown. It maintains cruise ship terminal access. It creates a continuous harbor walk around from what will be a new development along South Station to the south of Point Channel, and then all the way around to Blue Hills Pavilion. And then from there, I didn't want to get too specific, but we have many options for continuing the harbor walk, again, in a very front of house, urban green infrastructure loop. So any number of ways that connect us continuously to Castle Island. And if we wanted to get even crazier, we could start talking about reclaiming land and air rights over existing rail yards and other not highest and best use land areas within the city. And there are many if you start to look at them. So what does this generate in terms of opportunity? Well, these are 2018 March numbers. And what we did was we looked at typical rents for the various different types of buildings that would be going into any potential development here. So a mix of lab, Class A office, housing, and retail. And a very minimal, almost too conservative FAR allowable of 6.0, which translated for almost 2 million square feet of terra firma created. This equals an area of over 25 million square feet. And if you think that it's 30% of all these above uses plus 10% retail at grade, it generates something in the ballpark of $1.8 billion of real estate value per year in just the rents. And again, these are speculations, these are architects' numbers, but that seems to me like a pretty big number of missed opportunity to cut the problem of protecting the neighborhood in half. And if we look at Plan A, which is business as usual, which we presented earlier, versus Plan B, which is our scheme, or our big idea, the value created is an additional $1.8 billion per year in rents. The capital cost is going to be roughly the same, whether we invested in 8.75 or 8.25 miles of urban coastline, or we invested in filling the land in 4.25 miles of coastline. Improvements. It should be about a wash. The maintenance will be smaller because it's half the protection necessary of the original plan. The damages would be roughly the same, potentially could go away if we build it just right. With a net benefit, factoring this in over the course of 50 years, a huge potential for a real estate boom in what's already a hot market, but it will continue to be so over the course of this time, as opposed to retreating inland, which is right now one of the viable options. So I know this sounds crazy, but we need crazy ideas to meet the challenges if we're going to make it to the 22nd century. So the three main takeaways on this presentation are our coasts are our most vulnerable property, but they're also our most desirable real estate. And so we have to play that into our advantage moving forward. We need big infrastructure and land development opening projects to expand and buy long-term climate change protection for the existing vulnerable sites of today. Simplifying the problem of how much protection we need can help tremendously, and it can also provide new opportunities to not only get people closer to the water and celebrate the reason why Boston exists in the first place, but it can create a real estate boom and opportunities to enhance the health and wellness of the entire city, not only here in this neighborhood, but other neighborhoods and also other coastal cities. And again, if you thought I was crazy putting this together, remember that just 9 months ago, Times Square would have been packed, full of traffic, full of people. This is a ballerina doing a show. I believe it was sometime in April or May of this year, with a mask on, in Times Square, and nobody around. And it's just to show you that we can change when we have to, and we can think big when we have to. And we're currently retrofitting the way that we do everything right now. So suddenly it makes this big idea seem just a little bit more plausible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave, and we'll let him move forward with his big idea on how to help the city thrive in 2020 and beyond.
Appreciate folks joining us again. As Blake said, we're hoping that this is going to be the one session at ABX that gets you back into that pool of good ideas. So it's kind of taking us away from the day-to-day and back into the world of possibility. That's really something that design and engineering professionals is dream big. So wanted to be a little bit irreverent here. I'm calling mine cold pills and hot tubs. Let's just right into our climate adaptation choices. So we can mitigate, we can stop building up, stop procreating, we can build less. We can colonize Mars, as Blake mentioned. Elon Musk is hoping to do, and Matt Damon already did in the Mars. Another Matt Damon reference. We can move our existing stuff out of harm's way. We can relocate away from scary stuff. Or as Mike said, we can make land, keep making land, keep building, as we've done for 3.5 centuries in Boston. Or we can build differently. So, we've flown too many miles already. We have idled in our Harlow's Taco Bell drive-thrus too long. The chart at the right is 415 parts per million of carbon emissions in 2019. And it's projected that though COVID has made an impact, it's not going to make a permanent impact. And it looks like even more carbon is getting released as you watch this presentation. So is mitigation important? Sure. It's not going to happen fast enough. So the choices are kind of clear. It's still too late to mitigate. We're unlikely to stop building and give up. We're unlikely to stop procreating and building less. I'm sure we can think about colonizing Mars. And, some are excited about that, maybe Isabel as well. It's giving you a hard time. Moving out of harm's way, that's expensive, and politically that's really tough. Same thing with relocation. Not that these are bad strategies, it's just the Seaport District that Blake has talked about, it seems unlikely. We're unlikely to stop growing or throw away the billions we've already invested in. So building differently, there's an idea. So let's start with Blake's newly created land, which is amazing. We've got new land, that's super exciting, but not so fast. Remember, we have to build better. So I don't think it's too much to ask to put some basic stipulations on Blake's amazing new land and start poking some holes in it, almost literally. So Blake showed you some climate projections from the Climate Ready Boston map explorer. You can find that online. What is it we fear the most? Here's coastal flooding, as he showed. But that's relatively easy. We can build higher. So why complicate things? Just go ahead and build higher. So with that done, we're set. That was pretty easy. And since the existing bridges from Boston to the Seaport District are at higher elevations, such as Summer Street, they run about 10 to 12 feet higher for some portions, there's already precedent in the area for raising roads to meet the elevated sites. So he touched on extreme heat. This is daytime land surface temperature. We'll come back to this because this is the other side of the coin. Touched on stormwater flooding, near, medium, long term. However, this doesn't really cover cloudburst events where 3.9% of precipitation, I'm not saying you might know this already, but you might need to know it for a quiz, who knows. 3.9 inches of precipitation falls in a 1 hour period. So we can grab this bull by the horns and be proactive before we develop those new sites that Blake is proposing and put those lazy horizontal surfaces to work. Now, what do I mean by that? So think of a 2-inch rain. That adds 70,000 cubic feet of water to our newly made land, like we have in most of the Seaport District, very impervious area. Where's that all going to go? So we could precondition how that newly land made is developed. Say, set aside 5 to 10% open space, which could include setbacks. So let's say that area can't be the usual hardscape. Say we can't go below 0.6% runoff coefficient or 60% permeability, something like that. What kind of impact would that have? Just take a look around the seaport. How are we doing so far? So to the north, you can see that there are already some significant open spaces. So there's a lot of potential there. There's a fair number of green spaces. As you get closer to the port, to the ship terminal, it's pretty terrible. This kind of sucks. Who wants to be by the water here? There's not a lot of places where one wants to be, and I realize these are not best uses, right? These are undeveloped spaces currently, but that's a lot. So back to what that new land is made of, we can precondition. There's a fantastic opportunity right under our feet to address not only the challenges in inland flooding, cloudburst events, but also the other side of the equation, which is that extreme heat, by keeping water available on site when it's most needed. So what's under here right now? It's rarely ever dirt. It would take a lot of H&H studies to find out, maybe one big one, but we can look around us and get a decent idea. So in the Seaport District in Boston, like many other coastal cities in America and across the world, is built on crap. Chicago built its museum campus into Lake Michigan using debris from the Great Fire, bricks, busted plates, dirt. And, yeah, unfortunately for subsidence, organic matter. Same thing for San Francisco, same thing for New York, same thing for Boston. These are some other views around. It's a real ad hoc kind of experience as to what's underneath there on the coast. And if you remember from civil engineering or geology, remember your soil types? I don't either. But Boston is group C, which is a sandy clay loam. It's got I have a question mark here, but it's a fairly high runoff, fairly low runoff potential. The infiltration rates are low, and these are soils with a layer that impedes the downward movement of water. So it's pretty poor soil. Some of the soil here is worse. What kind of soil is this under the parking lot? I call it soil type K for crap. So it's a real ad hoc situation here. We've got to ask ourselves, what's under there? So this is a design opportunity. What do we want to be under there? Building higher is, to a large degree, an opportunity for us to redesign what is under there and how we might put it to use as something other than just fill. We're not just filling space. We want to do something with that. Here's where the holes come in. So in this slide, think of the void space in the soil. Those are places where we can hold water. It can be pretty significant depending on the soil or fill type, the water table, the level of saturation of the soil, and this is really our reservoir. The newly made land that Blake is proposing is the reservoir for holding that soil. So these are runoff curve numbers, if anybody remembers that. If not, I don't really either. So how the water gets into the soil is also key. Does it move from above? Is it moving horizontally, subsurface? We need to be thinking not only of the runoff numbers. So Boston here averages 91 to 94% for commercial and business and industrial urban districts. We also need to think about infiltration rates and actually use them, deploy them as a micro adaptation strategy cumulatively, collectively, across multiple sites. So think of all of those sites collectively that we could precondition as newly made parcels with 5 to 10% open space that include setbacks. So not the usual hardscaping, remember that. So let's take a look. What does that look like for one of the smaller sites, dashed red? See what it looks like when it rains. So if we build densely in the urban cores Blake was talking about, keeping modest setbacks. These are not crazy setbacks, that's 60 feet in there. Moderately dense building envelope, which I'll touch on later. We still yield on this site an amazing amount of open space, 50%. Okay, that's a crazy idea. Not every site is going to have 50% open space. Fine. But if we think about what's below in that fill area, if we devote just 2 feet of the below grade volume, given those setbacks and assuming some sort of thickness of the containment structure, we still manage to detain over 70,000 cubic feet, 72,000 cubic feet of a storm or flood water, and that's a 2-inch rain, remember. So as a research question for you students out there, or folks that really want to dig into this, is that a lot? Is that, quote, enough? What's the design storm that we're anticipating here, and what kind of volume do we want to detain? Because this is something, again, we design. So just taking a step to the side a little bit, back to the language of made land. What if we make the land itself more productive? This is a slide here from the Chinampas in Mexico City. I visited last year, about a year ago, when you could still travel. Got some amazing food. And, as you know, Mexico City was built on a lake. This was constructed by dredging canals, piling it within these staked off areas and creating floating gardens, which really benefit from that lake water for thirsty roots, while providing a breath of transpiration for the immediate area. Pretty cool. So this is folks on barges that are taking that muck from the bottom that they've dredged up and piling it onto those kind of floating gardens. So pretty cool, I think. It seems like a really amazing place to be. The land is wildly productive. So I really love this example. But back to reality, the Seaport District is really valuable land, as Blake has alluded to. It's not likely to be given over to raising corn, beans, and squash. Maybe Matt Damon could grow some potatoes on a windowsill, but let's face it, we're not going to build exactly like this. This is the Seaport District. This was working waterfront in the traditional sense through the 1960s. So we can make it feel like one again. If we're not going to focus on a productive landscape that's beside, I would say, another productive ecosystem, which is the sea, let's at least get people used to being beside and on the water again, using the language of water, the language of ports. We're already speaking the language of the seaport. That shipping terminal nearby, why don't we extend it further using technology we're already familiar with? The Dutch have done this to great effect. You've probably all seen these floating homes in Ijsberg, Amsterdam. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. Marley's Roma Architects. I just think it's a fantastic project, and it's modular. This is really, really well done. So, while we're at it, why does the new land we make have to be just filled, down-filled, that sits there and does nothing? Can it float? At the bare minimum, it should keep our new investments above water. But what if we could fill that floating kind of inner tube with a reservoir of water? Water which we'll need later, is remember the extreme heat map. So yeah, this is a pool on a yacht. It's kind of crazy. Here's where the hot tubs come in. Can it float? Can we fill that floating inner tube with a reservoir of water? Is it just water, yuppies we're holding in there, with a yacht rock on in the background? You know, personally, I prefer Christopher Cross sailing away. I was going to try to play that as a video, but that's kind of tricky. So go listen to Christopher Cross, folks. Or can this be a place that's really alive? How about aquaculture? This is an example, aquaculture farm in Timor-Leste. This is kind of the scale that we're talking about here. Can we return the sea to the seafront? So again, crazy ideas, but those crazy ideas are something that designers love to run with. So another way of approaching this is horizontally, by shaping the land subtly as nature does. Now this is on the coast, this is shaped by wind and waves. I realize it's a little different. But you know, think of the Seaport District, it's almost totally flat. It's boring. Pretty different from many coasts that we'd like to be on. And for land that's adjoining what used to be salt marshes historically, it's actually unnatural. Just remind yourself how water naturally lies on the land. There are spaces for it to sit there and fill in. I love the concept of reference landscapes. This is from college classes that I love. They offer a comparison to other landscapes which are still in a natural or relatively undisturbed state. And that points to modest changes in elevation of coastal lands, which immediately adjoin salt marshes. And this is a painting from local guy, actually, Martin Johnson Heed. He's got a couple of paintings in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Check it out, they're quite lovely. So this is about 150 years ago, and I know things changed. Depends on local geology, but really salt marshes changed very little. This would have been the case in the area of Roxbury Creek and Point Channel, which we'll touch on in a second. Notice that 16-foot long hay wagon, so by the time you get to the shore, you know, maybe the scale's off a little bit, but there's a substantial change in elevation at the shore. This is something you see fairly often. So again, we've got the step up to the shore. Modest changes in topography leave other places high and dry. That's the facts. That's the way we can actually do this. This is an example from the resiliency plan for Nassau County in New York. Is an example of playing with that topography. So the trick is to hold water either above or below grade, not just from the seaside, but also inland, rainfall, so that it has time to soak, recharge the groundwater, and provide evaporative cooling in the hot months. And we can do this on large scales, especially if we have the advantage of horizontal distance. There's the Moakley Park project, which is a fantastic project. I think Isabella's going to touch on that. And it builds a set of dunes, artificial, well, a constructed dune. You've got a berm on the inside, kind of belts and suspenders, but don't forget that we've got water coming from the inland side of things, in this case, the South Boston neighborhood. So we can't absorb the sea, but we can detain stormwater and manage inland flooding to a degree. And we can also do this on a smaller site scale. This is actually from the proposal for the Point Channel open space plan, which we didn't get, unfortunately, but still thought our ideas were good. So make that water have to work to get to your building, drive it uphill. And while it's being forced to move horizontally, it's losing ground, literally, by being absorbed through more porous surfaces. And if you have the advantage of horizontal distance, You can try to balance cut and fill. You can hold the water on the land, let it infiltrate, and retain the peak flow or flood water. And it's the opportunity to add some movement, some interest, give some interest to the land. This happens inland also. This is just a stream in the woods, so even a couple of feet of elevation change holds a lot of water. There are lots of ways to do this: stormwater detention, infiltration trenches, tree pits, bioswales. This is an example alongside Longfellow Bridge. It's a stormwater detention basin, which keeps water from flowing straight into the Charles River. You'll hear more about these kinds of techniques from Isabel later. So in this one, it's the water has to move through these baffles, gets infiltrated long before it goes out into the Charles River. So it's also cleaning the water in the process. And it creates a pretty interesting space for people to jog and walk along, and introduces some wildlife spaces. Aquatic plants help to clean that water and absorb it. Sometimes water gets held by accident. This is just a park along the Charles River. But we can design it that way. We can be intent about it. See, nobody's freaking out over a bit of water in their park. They can just use the elevated walks. In Ellicott City, Maryland, they even proposed taking out urban city blocks in their historic district, which is really hardscaped and impervious. And they thought about that because stormwater exacerbated by a nearby stream that overflows in heavy rains had nowhere else to go. So this is a pretty risky idea in the downtown historic district. I think it's very interesting. So we can subtly alter that topography and shape the land as we've done for centuries. So, Seaport District that's so flat, part of the excitement of being on the coast is those subtle changes, those ups and downs, those shifts in views. Using elevated walks, using the language of the seaport. We're already used to walking on gangways and boardwalks to get to boats and ships. It provides the added benefits of meeting ADA compliance. Maybe giving some opportunities to fine-tune keeping people high and dry when flooding does occur, like they might do in Venice temporarily. So you'll be shaping both the land and the walking surfaces, which won't always be one and the same. So don't forget, back to that. This is the extreme heat map. So we need to hold that water on site to cool things. So what happens in reverse, right? So as water is already held on that site, infiltration occurs, it recharges the aquifers, evapotranspiration is occurring, there's plants on site, on terraces, on roofs, green roofs, rooftop gardens. They can lower the ambient temperature by anywhere from 25 to 40 degrees in some locations. And this reduces the cooling load for building mechanical systems, and it makes it less likely that somebody's going to die from a heat stroke, whether walking around or inside your building. So back to that view of the Seaport District, does this look inviting to you? Some places are walkable, some good planning is happening. But looking to the right, that dashed red line, do we really want to build right up to the sea? If we develop lakes, new land parcels like they did the World Trade Center, this is the areas in the dash, that's World Trade Center here, along the water, it's really a missed opportunity. It's unfair to the many talented landscape architects, engineers out there who've designed way more sensitive ways of meeting the water, not just recently, but for many years. This is public space and river walls in Lisbon, Portugal. So I think we can afford to give up a little bit more of our developed area if we build higher, and this is not a novel concept. Give a more generous setback to the waterfront is not too much to ask. 100 feet is the setback that's shown in the Point Cho 100 acres master plan development. This has been on the books for about a dozen years. So shouldn't that be a bare minimum, 100 feet for global cities along the water? And this isn't even sea frontage. The Point Channel is not fronting on the sea. So let's double it. What would that look like? Something like this. Hold back 200 feet and build up 300 feet max. So you get some open space with infiltration trenches if you do, like I was showing, corrugating that land effectively, balancing that cut and fill. Maybe it makes it a little tougher to mow, but if you do that, you can contain a 2-inch stormwater event. That's a lot of water on one parcel. It's really significant. Now imagine those techniques that are combined, holes and hills and some hot tubs, not only for the newly made land, but for adjoining parcels as they get adapted over the next however many years, because we are going to be adapting some of these parcels, right? We're talking about building for the long run. It's not just the spaces that Blake was talking about. We're also talking about some of these really underdeveloped pieces of land here, and those connections that Blake was showing. You've got a real opportunity if you're combining these strategies, holes and hills. So here's a quick code. I'm going to go through it really quick. Just give me the whole Fort Point channel. That's all I ask. It's only 1.2 million square feet, something like that. It's kind of a drop in the bucket in this whole seaport district. So Blake touched on this earlier, but let's remind ourselves of the ecological history of the area. This is a map from 1903. Notice that the backwater, literally, Fort Point Channel. This is 1893, going back in time here. I want you to notice the salt marsh areas. Again, the salt marsh areas, this is an 1873 map. So that dashed red line is those really undeveloped areas. This is, I think it's something like a 1940s map. Again, here's your salt marsh, a dashed line. And here's an urbanized Roxbury Creek, which is now mostly piped and buried, and it's under development. So really, you know, Fort Point Channel, it's a beautiful place, don't get me wrong. It's a lovely sunset view, but it's mostly a dead body of water. It just is. This is Gillette, which has a processed water outflow into the Fort Point Channel. Yuck. We can do something better with this area. And that has been proposed. This is from Climate Ready South Boston, which Blake touched on. It's a naturalized edge that they're proposing. I think they did some very good work on this. And it corresponds to what was there long ago, right? A little more naturalized, but it's really enough. For $108 to $139 million price tag. Now I would say, why don't we let the Fort Point Channel be a real contrast to the rest of the 75 to 90% hardscape Seaport District? There is no park in the Seaport District. Well, there's some small ones, I take that back, but really there's no major park. Let's make this a regional park, make it a wetland, a wildlife area. So in short, you want to make it a destination. If you're going to develop this much land, you need some lungs, you need a breathing space, not just a glorified drainage ditch. So fill that Fort Point Channel in, let it silt up. Then you can build moderately densely on the parcels, that's 100 acres, immediately adjoining the channel. There's a lot of building you can have on that site and still maintain a lot of open space. Now this is probably the worst Photoshop job you've ever seen, but you get the idea. Something major in this area. Again, you can build a lot while balancing that natural area. So if we scale up that vision of coastal development, it's built denser and higher to respond to sea level rise while introducing some new topography for catching and retaining water and introducing naturalized edges. How do we need to refine what's existing? This is the Resilient Boston Harbor Plan. I think it's excellent. Do we need to tweak it? Again, as Blake was showing. So here's Fort Point district. Here's the area that Blake was talking about, and we're still kind of using that zigzag kind of snaggletooth edge. Is there something you need to do to tweak it? There's a Fort Point channel and green space along. So I want to leave you with a couple of research questions and some challenges. So scale it up. Think about the coast of New England, the entire coast. Think big. What's the length of that coastline? What is the percentage of coastal properties that are developed or urbanized right now? What's the projected growth? Blake talked about new people that are going to be moving in. It's only going to get denser. 60% of the world is going to be urbanized. I can't remember what percentage are going to live on the coast. What's the projected growth or the percentage of coastal properties that will be developed? What's the volume of stormwater that's going to fall on that area? And I focus on stormwater because we're already building higher, but easy. Accounting for future projections, of course. What's the potential available catchment area required to detain that volume? And how long do we want to detain that for? And finally, what's the percentage of impervious area that's required to eliminate peak outflows? Eliminate, just not just slow them down. So I'm going to leave you with some challenges. Can you manage not only the stormwater that falls on your site, but your neighbors? How do we monetize this? Again, this is not just stormwater. This is water. This is a life-giving force that we want to retain and use to cool. And there's some advantage to being able to do that if your neighbor can't do it. Maybe you can monetize it. And again, if you're going to create new land, put it to work. Don't just build back like you used to, and then let it be impervious area. So finally, we want to design smarter and build differently. So you have your slide.
So maybe tuning into my version of Resilience Provocations, a holistic strategy for the 21st century, an inspirational strategy. We'll see. I'm approaching the topic from a slightly different angle than my architect colleagues, given my training as a planner and geographer, and also with a background in soil science. So stay tuned on that. So here is my agenda for this presentation. I will just briefly talk about resilience and the goals behind it, what we want to accomplish and how, before showing some resilience strategies with a focus on stormwater transportation and energy infrastructure. So I wanted to take a moment and look at the reasoning behind the resilience movement to achieve a better understanding of the ingredients that actually make it a successful strategy. So this slide here shows the global carbon dioxide emissions since the 1000s. And as we know, our climate is changing due to an increase in carbon emissions. So carbon dioxide thereby is leading the charge, as it's sticking around in the atmosphere for up to 10,000 years before it finally dissolves. And from ice core measures, you might recall those videos and films made in the 80s and 90s. Scientists discovered that those ice cores actually contain carbon emission, and so they were able to trace it back and demonstrate an increase in those emissions. And so what we're seeing here, carbon dioxide was below 300 parts per million for the longest time until the beginning of industrialization in the 1880s. And until now, so it's increased up to 418 parts per million last year. So today we're actually a little lower thanks to COVID, but I'm sure we'll get back to a higher emission. So as scientists, as I said, as we discovered end of last century, carbon emissions create the so-called greenhouse gas effect, which leads to rising temperatures in the atmosphere. This is shown when you compare this slide and the following slide. So this slide shows the temperatures in the 1880s, so before the industrialization, and this slide shows temperatures in 2013 to 2017. We have seen an increase in 1 degree Celsius since then. And why is that? Why does that matter? So IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, set a threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, so 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and they say this amount is crucial, as it's kind of like if we increase the amount, or if our temperature rises 2 degrees higher than the 1850 average, we're getting into serious trouble and our climate actually might collapse. So right now we're on a course to reach those 2 degrees Celsius increasing in the 2060s. So we're on a straight course towards there. So I'm challenging Dave here a little bit as to that mitigation is too late. So I will try to show throughout this presentation that we have to mitigate and adapt. So now we've already been experiencing a change in the climate since the 1960s. What you see here are changes in precipitation. And you also see that they vary regionally. So we have drought conditions and we have precipitation increases. The Northeast, where we are, has seen a major increase in precipitation, so which is why we have to focus very much on stormwater adaptation as a means. Globally, the changing climate has led to more intense storms and strong hurricanes, such as Hurricane Harvey in Houston and Texas in 2017, or typhoons in other parts of the world. And as we know, those incidents also bring with them incidental fires, environmental and natural hazards, dislocation of families, etc. And on the other hand, we've seen an increase in devastating fires due to drought conditions and lightning in Australia earlier this year and California this summer. So zooming in on Boston, just a quick reminder, we already saw this similar slide that Blake presented. But in 2018, we experienced several major storm events. These are the impacts from the bomb cyclone aftermath in January 2018, which also brought a record high tide. So never measured storm surges were indicated in Boston. And this slide here shows the northeaster in March that same year. Now we might be intimately familiar with those new records in high heat, drought conditions, and rainstorm events of increasing magnitude. And we might even forget about why that's actually important and why that matters. And it's almost registering as the new normal. But we should remind ourselves that this is only the beginning, and we will see much stronger and more devastating storms on a more frequent basis in the future. But these storms are all linked to higher temperatures, due to our oceans holding more warmer water, and since we are not really stopping greenhouse gas emissions from increasing, those seas are going to increase in warmth, and which will lead to even higher and more magnitude storm events, which is what I mean with the climate might eventually collapse at some point. And so we've also experienced sea level rise already in the past decade. So that has been documented. And what we've seen on the other slides from my fellow presenters are that we're going to reach 40 inches of sea level rise by 2017. But these predictions are only still based on like 2016 greenhouse gas emissions, and they might change. So as practitioners, we have a responsibility to plan for climate change, and this starts with understanding the risks and vulnerabilities and making a plan for it. Mere adaptation won't be enough. So we also have to reduce our carbon emissions to limit. So we have to reduce them to limit further increase in temperature. So which brings me to the 3 resilience strategies I promote here, and which are also shared by the Kresge Foundation. They define resilience as reducing greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change mitigation measures, as fighting for consequences of climate change that are no way, so adaptation measures, and as fostering social cohesion and inclusion. So what that means is that in order to make those necessary changes, we have to factor the people in. And I've listed some examples here for those strategies, and I will talk about these in more detail later. But we need, people are needed because they actually need to change their behavior, and eventually also need to pay for the needed investment. And so with this definition of the Kresge Foundation of Resilience, 3 pillars I'm going to promote today are carbon reduction, protection, and social cohesion. So how do we get there? The Boston Harbor Vision Plan released a couple of years ago paints a beautiful and accessible and green vision of our coastline, which at the same time is protecting us from sea level rise and future storm surges. And I will talk about it some more in the future. So I mentioned people. So the strategy should play also towards creating a healthier, cleaner, safer, more enjoyable, and less car-centered environment, so we can actually reduce greenhouse gases, and people are buying into that. So these pictures actually show real-time conditions, or show real conditions. The bike culture in Copenhagen is shown here. And we have outdoor dining shown on the picture on the upper right in Davis Square, just taken a couple of weeks ago. Thanks to COVID, we now have plenty of outdoor dining spaces. So this is great. Can we build on this? Can we build on this movement? So let's start with how we can advance those strategies forward. And looking at the biggest greenhouse gas emitters, we have buildings, heating and cooling, we have energy production, and we have the transportation sector. And I will focus on energy and transportation and the following some more. Boston has already set its goal to become carbon neutral by 2050 and has set its guidelines, frameworks, and policies that support these measures, and also they're working towards smart utilities. So I challenge us to do even more, because we need to act faster and ideally meet the carbon neutrality goal earlier than 2050. So a good plan starts with an actual understanding of the risk and vulnerability. And this slide here, similarly to what we've seen on previous slides from my colleagues, but it shows in blue the coastal flooding conditions in 2030 and 2070, and in green the stormwater flooding based on a 1% chance storm in 2070. And this slide goes a little further, and it looks at the vulnerability. So what is actually exposed to those flooding events? And so the colors go from blue, lighter exposure, to red, high exposure, and you see there's a maximum of 16.2 feet of flood depth. So this includes the 4 feet of sea level rise by 2070. And just to orient ourselves, so not everybody is used to those maps. So this is a plan map. North is actually to the right. So we have Southie here, and then Columbia Point, and as we approach Huntington Beach and portions of Norfolk. So let's take a closer look at the vulnerabilities. How does the 2070 1% chance storm actually impact our infrastructure. And what we see here is a slide from the Climate Ready Dorchester report, which was just released. We were happy about it. And it shows the conditions in gray for 2030 and in light gray for 2070. Again, the 1% chance storm. And we see pretty clearly that a lot of portions of transportation are imposed to those flood events. So we're seeing major portions of Morrissey Boulevard flooded, and also the blue lines here are rail tracks, so notably about JFK and UMass, and we have here the rail line coming into Port Norfolk Station. And then on the other hand, I will be talking about stormwater in the following a little bit more. So what is notably here is that a lot of the combined storm water sewer outfalls are also going to be flooded here. And in addition, we have a couple of pump stations, known as these diamonds, that are also going to be impacted, and which will cause some issues eventually. In order to get a better understanding of how coastal flooding may affect the city, the Boston Water and Sewer Department Commission developed a two-dimensional model that analyzes different storm scenarios for the entire infrastructure within the city. This model includes the sea level rise conditions in the 2070s, and it can simulate the effects of tides and different rainstorm events through different time series. It's pretty amazing. We used this model to simulate flood conditions for the development of stormwater strategies at Milford Park. And what we can see here are the different, in the different color. Red is 1 feet of depth, and yellow is 6 feet of depth of flooding. And we see that again several outfalls are surcharging as well as transportation infrastructure, as we just discussed. And so why is this an issue? Why is this a problem? As we know, if water can't infiltrate into the soil, it cannot discharge quickly enough through the pipes because there is too much rain at the same time, because of localized flooding where it falls. During high tides, this may also lead to backflow, and water may surcharge at manholes. So we create even more flooding. And with rising tide conditions, you can guess what's happening then. So in addition to this, the pump stations also only function if they are not flooded, obviously. So solutions that were developed or that were suggested in the Climate Ready Dorchester report, which is also available for download, are portions of gray measures, such as elevating pump stations, elevating the expressway and Morrissey Boulevard, the Harbor Walk, and also the installation of tide gates. So critical infrastructure definitely needs to be adapted and flood-proof against saltwater and tidal influences. But then again, and we heard from Dave about this very beautifully, there is also a role for hybrid and green infrastructure measures, and those take approaches into account that are a little bit more flexible. And so when we have like natural buffer systems. An example of this is Cimate Park, the resilience strategy, and these strategies that were developed there, and I will touch on this in a second. So just to remind ourselves, gray stormwater infrastructure essentially captures the rain into pipes, and the water that is captured or is not captured, the stormwater runoff, and that actually goes untreated into other surface water bodies. So again, if we have the 4-point channel, that will end up there, for example, untreated. But if we have green infrastructure measures, also as Dave showed, they can actually take over some of the burden of grain infrastructure since rain is naturally absorbed by the green infrastructure and is cleaned and filtered and becomes part of the natural water cycle. And by doing so, we're actually also reducing the carbon footprint. So again, it's a win-win situation. So we have like green infrastructure not only beautifying and helping with adaptation, but it's also a mitigation strategy. And we already heard from Dave about blue and green roofs, helping with lowering and heating costs. So this is another example why green infrastructure measures are a critical thing. So let's talk about Mowgli Park. So this is just a quick slide on Mowgli Park to orient ourselves and what will happen as early, what will happen in 2070 in a 1% storm event, that it will essentially become a major flood pathway and that coastal water will flow towards large portions of the neighborhood. So which is why it is like a catalytic and a major project. And also another notion on tying it back to Dave here, the soils that can be found at Mowgli Park are partly clay soils, so which have like a very high runoff potential, so low infiltration. And in a storm event, the ball fields there, essentially the water just stands there and it doesn't infiltrate, so which is a major issue. And so which is also why Mowgli Park, the strategy that was deployed there, looks at those stormwater and coastal water flooding strategies. So this slide here is a conceptual design slide, and it's based on the storm flood pathways that Woodsville Group modeled. So they are currently also developing a new model for coastal flooding, which incorporates more recent greenhouse gas emissions. So it's more accurate than what we've been using in the Climate Ready Boston model and in the past, essentially. And you see pretty much up to this red line here. This is like what will later on kind of like become a berm or a flood alleviation barrier, as they call it. And this is what was designed with these strategies that were at hand. So previously, Mowgli Park didn't really feel like a coastal park, and still does not, because it's kind of like also separated by Day Boulevard and from Carson Beach. But so the intent of the new design will look at more typical coastal strategies of dunes and beaches and wetland areas and marshes that where even the war are going to be deployed eventually. And this is a screenshot from the site. So this is essentially looking at the site from the Bay City location. And you see various stormwater strategies that were deployed here. And stormwater meadows are something notably pretty cool strategy that was deployed. And also we have a hybrid solution here of these underground water tanks that is designed. So all in all, Mowgli Park is a great example of multi-benefit solutions because we have, so first of all, we have both stormwater and coastal flooding addressed, but also it was very interesting to hear from the people and what they would like to see and other parts that may be even more accessible and people wanted to bike there and just enjoy it even more than they can today. So this all was incorporated into the slide and into the strategies. So with my second strategy, I want to focus on the transportation sector, which, as we mentioned, is one of the the larger greenhouse gas emitters. And just to remind ourselves, we have some serious flood issues to deal with in the future. So these are pictures from downtown Boston, and these are this is the aquarium. So the T station is not very usable in 2070 in a 1% sandstorm. So again, these are simulations from the BWC 2D model. So these aren't pictures of real events yet. So how are we going to deal with that? So one solution might be to bring good old duck tours back into the plan and use those as a major transportation medium. But it becomes pretty clear that we need more hardened and flood-proof and elevated infrastructure. And what's been proposed by Climate Rochester are elevation of the harbor walk and roadway sections. But to be provocative, here's another idea that strikes as being a little bit more holistic. And it kind of like comes back to the notion is, if we would be able to actually protect our coast ledge, wouldn't it be beautiful to have the city more usable for people? Can we create healthy, walkable, bikeable places and get rid of the cars? So kind of like the status quo we have right now. Can we extend on this? And one strategy here would be to create a really truly multimodal city which focuses on biking and walking and public transit in the city and leaves the cars outside of the city. And as advertised earlier, I'm a fan of Elon Musk and a fan of his ideas, and this is a picture from the Boring Company. So why don't build another tunnel and build a bigger tunnel that actually meets the needs, because the artery that was built just a couple of decades ago is always congested. I mean, not in these days, but typically it's pretty congested. So it makes sense to come up with a different strategy, a different solution, and a bypass tunnel for transit that doesn't even want to go through or go under Boston City proper might be just the way to do. The second transportation strategy could focus on redesigning the street network, so it's actually easy and faster to get around by bike or by foot or by public transit. So the left side, the left picture is a picture of Copenhagen, and they developed a regional bike network needs assessment to safely drive from surrounding communities into town. Based on the limitations, they then actually developed a plan to overcome those hurdles. For comparison, we have Boston's bike network on the right side. And an inspiring idea might be to create a regional bike master plan that actually looks at the missing links from surrounding communities that would love to bike to Boston, like within a 30 or 40-minute commute. So Copenhagen had a vision to become carbon neutral by 2035. And they also have the vision of becoming the new Amsterdam in terms of cycling. And so their plan was to have 50% of their people cycle to work. And the way they approached this is they made huge investments in the cycling infrastructure, into cycling bridges, shown here, into walking bridges. And then most notably, they created like a major highline, a 3-lane bike highway to move people around. And they did this because they interviewed people and they got the notion that people would use the bike more often if they actually would feel safe. So based on this notion, they created 3 different bike lines, and you can see this on the picture on the right, on the upper right. There's a fast lane, there's a regular lane, and like a slow commute for older people or kids, just people wanting to take a slope. And another thing they invested heavily in are technical assistance measures, or such as these LED green lights, which were implemented into the street. And they are actually programmed so that they create like a green way for bikes and public transit in the morning hours into the city. And the overall goal was, and they achieved that it is easier and faster to use the bike or public transit to get around downtown. And this is also shown here on the picture in the upper right. So thirdly, as far as transportation strategies go, I would like to suggest to invest even more in public transportation, such as EV bus rapid transit solutions. Shown here is the most recent inaugurated BRT line in Everett, which started up as a kind of like pilot project, and people loved it, so they jumped on it, and it was just recently inaugurated. Similarly, we have the Harvard BRT here, or the future Summer Street BRT. And so the idea would be to also electrify the fleet and get more people out of their single-owned vehicles and into buses that use carbon-free energy. So then again, so the last transportation strategy would be to strengthen the regional transit and also electrify the fleet. And this notion comes with a nod to the major coalitions that are already underway, also building on Go Boston 2030, and acknowledging that there is already a lot of conversation around like how to work together, knowing that the MBTA line doesn't cover it all, and that there has to be a more regional approach to get people around and also solve the last mile. So overall, the strategy would be to make the services of public transportation more attractive, to get the ridership up, get people out of their cars, and maybe install more television on buses, have charging outlets. But for most, redistribute funds for this public transit and biking lines. My third resilient strategy looks at carbon-free energy. And this is an infrastructure component that is also already underway. But for a vision, I would like to propose, like envisioning a totally electrified energy sector which bases energy consumption entirely on renewable energy, both on-site and off-site, and that before the current goal of 2050. For inspiration, I was looking again at Copenhagen. As I said, they set a goal of 2035 to become carbon net zero. And their energy strategies include renewable energies. They installed offshore wind turbines over 25 years ago. They have solar panels and biofuels, and microgrids for district heating and cooling are just the common thing. With respect to the offshore wind farm, this was realized through a co-op, a district-wide energy fund, which looked at local residents to buy in to help finance the wind farm, which was pretty interesting. So in Massachusetts, we recently enacted some policies and acts towards renewables. The 2016 Act to promote energy diversity and the 2018 Act to advance clean energy. And they already promote renewable energies such as solar, on and offshore wind. And as we know, at this point, there are only 7 offshore wind turbines installed in the United States, and 5 of them are shown here on the picture on the upper right in Block Island by Ørsted, and 2 are down in Virginia. But what's shown here on the right side are the lease areas that the developers are developing for, they're building out for. And in total, 3.2 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity shall be installed by 2035. I've challenged this even more and then say the neighboring state of New York City, the neighboring state of New York has 9 gigawatts of offshore wind under their purview, and they are going to, they're progressing really fast. So I'm challenging the administration to install or to offer more of these areas for offshore wind in Massachusetts. And lastly, I want to also look at geothermal energy. So building on Dave's hot tub analogy here. So wouldn't it be nice to actually use hot air for our hot tubs? And what's shown here is a building owned by Boston University, and they operate their entire building with geothermal energy to heat and cool. And for doing this, they tap 1,500 feet below the street level into the soil, into the core, and then circulate the hot air up. Upfront installation costs are a little bit higher, so 30 to 40% higher than regular fuel source generators, but then the payback rate is only 7 to 10 years. So it seems like a pretty smart investment. And in addition to deep wells, there's also the option of using ground source for heating and cooling, and those surface heat exchangers are quite affordable and less expensive. So my suggestion and my resilience strategy here is to actually make more incentives available to install more renewable energies for private homeowners and on municipal buildings. But then also maybe start thinking about incentives for renters to become a part of this, because they're typically excluded from all of this. And again, looking at what Copenhagen has done with their offshore wind farm, they use private funds to help realize their offshore wind farm. So that might be quite a smart idea to create private public investment funds. And this might also help cash-strapped communities. So in closing, the key takeaways, what I wanted you to show with this presentation is that essentially resilience strategy, in my opinion, should follow 3 basic aspects, and these are both adaptation and mitigation, but then also a strong focus on the people and what they need. And by understanding the risks and vulnerabilities, we get a much better understanding of what we need to plan for. And so looking at the stormwater sector and coastal resilience strategies, I try to also make the point as to like how multi-benefit strategies can better reach those resilience goals. Before I launched into stormwater, transportation, and energy infrastructure, with 2 of them being some of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters. So with that, I hope to have made the point that successful solutions should always have more than one benefit, and I hope I relate some of my vision for how Boston can become more resilient in a more beautiful way.
All right, everybody. So we'll stop there. I know that we had just a few minutes left. I'm sorry we went a bit long. We got a little bit of a late start, but we tried to squeeze in 90 minutes into this as best we could. So I've done my end on answering as many of the questions as I could as they came in. If anybody has any last minute comments or thoughts or questions, that are still on the call, we're more than welcome to convene those. It looks like we have Dave on the call with us now. So not sure if anyone has any closing thoughts, but as you saw, we had a lot of fun geeking out on this topic. And even though we didn't get to sort of concrete solutions per se, I think that what we've provided are solutions and strategies that aren't necessarily being addressed during sort of state of today development, and also looking ahead to some of our neighbors in Europe, as we often have to do here, to see what's coming down the line in the next decade or so in terms of thinking about this topic and resilience. So I'll turn it back over to the committee chairs and the audience if you have any thoughts or last minute notions. And thanks for joining us too, by the way.
All right, thank you everyone for participating. I personally really enjoyed the presentation. Peter, do you have any thoughts to add or before we close the meeting? All right, so I guess thank you everyone once again for attending, and thank you for your time, and hopefully we see you again next month.
Looks like Peter might be muted.
Oh, Peter, you muted? Hello? Hello?
This could go for a while.
It's way for...
No, we can't hear you, Peter.
Are we good?
Peter is saying something really good, and I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, I think we're probably good unless we can figure out what's going on his end. It shows that he's not muted, so.
Yeah, we might have some computer glitch.
It's all good. Well, we'll catch up with him soon. And anyhow, thank you guys for indulging us and giving us an opportunity to share some of the work that we're interested in.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to us if something comes into your mind at a later time.
All right, so I'm gonna end the meeting, and thank you once again.
Thanks again. Take care. Stay safe and happy holidays, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.